But if I asked you, by the way, where was Einstein born and what date? You'd say, well, I don't know, but I can look it up. So your mind palace is your bookcase, part of which you can see over there, which is mine. And so, you can look some things up, and that's the power of print. The huge value of being able to read anything, and you can learn everything is open to you, so long as your intellect can grasp it. And that's what education is. We are the species on Earth that takes longest to grow up.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Today I welcome Paul Strathern onto the pod to discuss the Renaissance, or to be exact, the other Renaissance. Paul has written a new book focusing not on the Italian Renaissance, but on that which took place further north, in the Holy Roman Empire, the Low Countries, France and England. So we talk about Martin Luther and Protestantism, Copernicus and the orbit of the sun, and Gutenberg and the printing press. We also go on to talk about a wonderful fellow, Paracelsus, to some the father of medicine, to others a quack. Paul himself has written many books on lots of different subjects, such as the history of economics, Napoleon in Egypt, the Borgias, and the Florentines. So there is unlikely to be anything he doesn't know. Now, Paul's voice is a little hoarse these days, but I do hope you can indulge him because what he has to say is endlessly fascinating. Coming up, I've got Napoleon's invasion of Russia, the revolutions of 1848, the Battle of Crécy with Gordon Corrigan, and much, much more. If you get the chance, listen back to my recent Film Club podcast with director Tim Hewitt talking about Ben Affleck's Argo, the Iranian Revolution set thriller. Next month, we're doing the financial crash films The Big Short and Margin Call. In the meantime, I'll hand you over to me talking to Paul Strathern. Paul Strathern, welcome. It's a real pleasure to speak to you about your new book, The Other Renaissance, from Copernicus to Shakespeare. So welcome.
Thank you, Oliver.
Now, I wanted to, because I'm certainly not an expert in this field, and you most certainly are, having written, this is a follow-on from your previous book, The Florentines. And
yeah.
And actually, you're something of a Renaissance man yourself, having been a philosopher, having taught philosophy and mathematics, and written books of across all different subjects. But I wanted to kick things off with rather a kind of mundane, maybe even annoying question, which is this book is entitled The Other Renaissance. But I was thinking, I'm aware of what the Renaissance is. But what's the best way to describe what it is?
Well, the Renaissance, most people tend to think of the Renaissance as being, well, certainly centered in Italy, and art, and going around Florence. And when you think of the Renaissance, you tend to think of names like Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, Lorenzo de' Medici, and this tends to emphasize Italian artistic, and also it's to Galileo in science, but a lot went on in the north, which tends to be overlooked, I think, a little bit. So, you could call this book the Northern Renaissance, but that makes it sound more of a textbook, and I wanted it for popularly. So the other Renaissance, and it tends to mention, as I say, the artists of the Northern Renaissance who actually introduced oil painting into Italy. Botticelli, for instance, and Leonardo, they all tended to work in fresco. And it's only later that they came to use oil painting, which is much more subtle and can be retouched, whereas fresco is painted straight onto a wall, and when it dries, that's why fresco meaning fresh. When it dries, that's it. You can touch it up a bit, but it's rather more, you have to do it at once. That's why it brings out the radiant colours of Botticelli, for instance. But Leonardo was able, when he went into oil painting, to paint, for instance, the Gioconda, the Mona Lisa, and he went on repainting that the whole of his life, because he could do this with oil, which he couldn't do with his other paintings. Anyway, he, in many ways, brought the Italian Renaissance to Northern Europe when the King of France invited him to live in France and gave him a small chateau near his own. And Leonardo was aging in those days and was towards the end of his life, in fact. And it's generally seen as Francis I bringing the Southern Renaissance through to the North, sort of in symbolic, in allegory, in real terms and in symbolic terms, because there was a Renaissance going on in Europe, of course, in the way that oil painting was there. And the main thing of the Northern Renaissance can be put down in three things. I would think Luther and the Reformation, Copernicus and the heliocentric idea of the universe, and the oil painting of Van Eyck. Those three different departments sort of epitomised the Renaissance north of the Alps. The Renaissance south of the Alps was financed and promulgated by the Medici family, who spent their money on it. They were a banking family, but they were beyond their prime in banking, and they'd taken over as the rulers of Florence. Now, the equivalent in the Northern Renaissance, the other Renaissance, was the Fugger family of Germany, who were in many ways much more rich than the Medici, and their interests extended from, Austria across Northern Europe to Spain. They financed the Holy Roman Emperor, and they also, in so doing, financed much of the art that was going on. And the Fugger, Jacob Fugger the Rich, was the one who helped finance the Holy Roman Emperor, and therefore sort of financed the, much of the Renaissance activities that were going on in that time. Quite aside from this, scientific Renaissance had begun to permeate Northern Europe, as we say, on its own. You had the Copernicus, and you had Erasmus, who was the great scholar, and he was the great humanist scholar, and humanist philosophy was in many ways the sort of spark for the Renaissance. It changed philosophical thinking to thinking about classical, ancient philosophy and thought and art, which was, in its own way, irreligious, and it was pagan. Roman, ancient Greek philosophy had philosophy, but the idea of God as such was, let's put it this way, light on the ground. It wasn't central. The central idea was that humanity was central. Human thought, the human being was central. And this was central to humanism of the Renaissance, which was present in South and the North. In the North and South, it was joined by, I would say, Erasmus, the main thinker of this. And he was Dutch, travelled to all parts of Europe. But his great friend was Thomas More in London, who was the right-hand man of Henry VIII, and was in fact his general factotum, right-hand man. And this was a dangerous position. In England at the time, his sponsor was Cardinal Wolsey, who fell foul of Henry VIII and was executed. Thomas More took over from Wolsey, and of course in the end suffered the same fate as him. He was beheaded. He fell foul of Henry VIII. In depth, Thomas More is dealt with brilliantly, of course, by the novels of Hilary Mantel.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about that actually, because the Thomas More in Hilary Mantel is not quite the sort of character you see in A Man for All Seasons, where he's this wonderfully noble figure, but he's less noble in the Hilary Mantel novels.
That's true. You had to stay alive if you were ambitious. You got to the top, and there were many people plotting against you. I mean, the period that Henry VIII went through was a great period of change. Henry himself broke with the Roman Church, having previously been a defender of the faith, which is why on our coins we still have the ruler of our country has Fid Def written on, which is defender of the faith, and that's was a title given by the Pope to Henry VIII. And when he broke with Rome and set up the Church of England, he kept this title, which is why it remains on our coins. And even Elizabeth II, and presumably Charles III's coins, which are coming out soon. Have they come out yet?
I don't know. I don't think they've come just yet, have they? No.
No. But
maybe in time for the coronation.
Yes, perhaps. Anyway, the stamps have come out, but that's aside from but after the Northern Renaissance.
I was going to ask you about the Reformation, but I'm glad we've got to that now. So the Reformation, I guess that encouraged the sort of the other Renaissance. Martin Luther, I suppose, earlier. But without Martin Luther, would you have had such a powerful other Renaissance? You wouldn't, would you?
No, I don't think so, because Martin Luther split Europe.
Almost north and south, didn't he?
It was north and south. Well, it was to a certain extent, but as I say, politics at that time was very much a moving, tectonic shifts were taking place. France was the greatest nation in Europe. The Holy Roman Empire was another powerful force. And part of the Holy Roman Empire were the German states, which were many and varied, some of which became Protestant, others of which remained Catholic. The sort of deciding role in this came at the end of the Northern Renaissance, when Europe destroyed itself in the 30 Years' War. Now, the 30 Years' War was initially Protestants against Catholic. Now, the most powerful Catholic nation was France, and the most powerful Protestant empire was the Holy Roman Empire. But when it became obvious that the Holy Roman Empire was doing so well, France decided, knowing that if the Holy Roman Empire succeeded, it would become the most powerful force in Europe. It decided to join up with Protestant Sweden, and therefore blocked the power of Holy Roman Empire, so that the balance of power was restrained by Catholic France joining Protestant Sweden, so that when the end came, Europe still had a balance, and France was held in check. So you had two powers, vaguely Protestant Holy Roman Empire and Catholic France. Now, this brought about the end of this came at the end of the Renaissance, because it in many ways destroyed Europe. But so the troubles in Europe were going apace on towards this throughout the Northern Renaissance, the other Renaissance. Quite obviously, things were breaking up. It's a very interesting parallel that the Renaissance, which echoes classical world, especially of ancient Greece, which consisted of warring states. Now, you had the same position, warring states in Italy, in the Southern Renaissance, and in Northern Europe. It seems that this breaking up of a hegemony brought about new ways of thinking and war, of course, and new ways of thought. I mean, the change of Copernicus from the world being the centre of the universe to the sun being the centre of the universe was a tremendous difference. I mean, it turned everything on its head. It was an idea, but it changed humanity's view of itself. Humanity was no longer centre of the universe, answerable to God, who was in charge. And so the spirituality of the pre-Renaissance, medieval era, which was our reward is in heaven, and this is for our behaviour, our spiritual behaviour on this earth. We will be judged in heaven, judged when we die, when we either go to hell, go to purgatory, purged of our sins, and then go to paradise. Now this, especially purgatory, was being put forward by the popes at the time, especially the Medici Pope, Pope Pius, who had people selling, dispensations. So you could buy it. So when you died, you spent less time in purgatory and went quicker to heaven. Now this was quite obviously just nonsense to Luther at any rate. And he challenged this. And many people who realized this was just supporting the Renaissance popes who were building the great buildings of Rome, which cost a fortune. St. Peter's in Rome, and they were, sponsoring the great artists to create St. Peter's and Sistine Chapel and painting of Sistine Chapel. All the great work of the Renaissance was sponsored by this money which was coming from the selling of dispensation for your time in purgatory. And this was, it annoyed a lot of people.
It's a bit of a racket. It's a bit of a racket.
To us now it seems a racket. To Luther it seemed a racket. And it obviously was a racket. But it was a racket which was strongly supported. You didn't go against the church. You went against the church at your peril. And Luther would not have survived but for the support of powerful princes in the region. He was in danger of his life if he hadn't been supported by powerful forces who saw it in their power and saw it in their interest to support Luther, lessen the power of the church, and therefore increase their own power. And as I say, this helped the power, the freedom and power of Northern Europe, and brought into being France retained its power, but it brought into power the power of England and the Dutch Netherlands, which gradually broke away from the Holy Roman Empire, which in fact, in the form of Spain, owned the Netherlands. And it was the breaking away that brought about the great Dutch art and the great English art when England broke away from the church. Henry VIII broke away with the church, and the time of Henry gave way to the Elizabethan age, which was England's great period, and hence this time I put the end of time as Shakespeare. You had Copernicus, who dislodged humanity from the centre of the universe, and this gave way to many great artists. Spain had great artists, and England had its own great artists in the form of often imported ones, such as Holbein, from whose great portraits of Henry VIII. That's how Henry VIII was brought to life to us. Our image.
Well, yes, our image of that whole period is thanks to Holbein.
Yes, Holbein is the young Henry, the great athletic figure, and the old and bloated, which is cunningly disguised. But if you look hard, you see that this is a man deeply gone to seed. His stomach is enormous. But of course, these portraits are taken from the front, so you only get a suggestion of this, figure.
So, Paul, you mentioned Copernicus, and I just wanted to know how revolutionary. Obviously, it's a revolutionary hypothesis that he could prove that the Earth orbited the Sun, but was he confirming what many believed, or how revolutionary was Copernicus's theory?
Several ancient Greek philosophers had posited a heliocentric universe. Many ideas like that flourished in Greece. But Copernicus was the first for many years, many centuries. This idea had been put forward, but rejected. And Copernicus was, in fact, a priest, a lay priest. He was a minor order. He was so he didn't want his book to go against the teaching of the church, which was sacrosanct, because it was based on the ideas of Ptolemy, which have been accepted by Aristotle, and the teachings of Aristotle became the intellectual foundations of the teaching of the church. Not just Aristotle, but Galen, the Greek Roman medical theorist and practitioner, of course. So when they became formalized, Aristotle's ideas became the Holy Writ. So Ptolemy very ingeniously had the Earth as the center of the universe, and the other things circled about the Earth, as they do seem to do. If we look in the Earth and we stand and we look and we examine the stars, they do appear to pass across the heavens in circles. So, in many ways, if you look at it from a scientific point of view, this is science as it is practiced. Science describes what happens. You see the stars and the planets going across heavens in circular fashion. Now, this involves an incredibly complicated centric circles. If you place the sun at the center, it suddenly becomes obvious that you have much more simple circles. Now, this is a much simpler hypothesis. that doesn't mean that Ptolemy was wrong. It meant his explanation wasn't as good. Because although it described the truth, because as we saw it, standing where we saw it, it was right, it was true. But when you change the universe, when you realize that we are not the center of the universe, then you have these circles. That's why science moves. Science moves by describing what we see, which always remains the same. We describe it in more detail. And thus, where certain ancient hypotheses have to be discarded because they're not quite right. And indeed, Copernicus described the center being the sun and the planets circling the Earth in circular orbits. Later, you would get Kepler, who understood perfectly well the ideas, as indeed did Galileo, the ideas, the heliocentric ideas of Copernicus, but he understood that these weren't quite right. The orbits that went around the sun were elliptical. And so, again, you have an improvement. You have a hypothesis, and then your closer examination, you get an improvement. And that's how science works. It works all the way through time, because it's observation. And from this observation, you make a theory. This theory doesn't quite describe everything. You look a bit closer, and it goes wrong. And then you get a further theory. Exactly the same as Newton described gravity. And this described why and how the planets moved around through the Earth. He also described gravity as this is why everything. I drop this pencil, it falls because it's attracted to the larger body of the Earth. This works. And then later you get Einstein, who described other further examinations which accounted for tiny anomalies in Newton's thought. And then you get quantum theory, which explains tiny anomalies in Newtonian and Einstein's thought. So more and more you get closer and closer observation. None of it is yes, it's wrong. The first observations, if what you see are correct, but they're a bit blurred. You can't see everything perfectly without a telescope, which is why the great expansion that Copernicus saw and was improved upon by Kepler was improved upon not with a telescope, because the telescope had not been invented. Well, it had been invented, but it wasn't used. These were used by the observations of an amazing man called Tycho Brahe, a Danish astronomer, who literally, with his own eyes, took an enormous amount of observations of the stars. And this enabled Kepler to realize that the stars, the planets circling around the thing, didn't precisely follow a circle, but they traveled an ellipse. And that's how science advances, and that's how scientists who used observation, and the beginning of this observational science was, of course, Galileo. But many of Galileo's best disciples, so to speak, were in the north, and they came in Elizabethan England. Sir Francis Bacon is the classic example in Britain, and you've got Brahe and Kepler, Brahe's observations, and Kepler's sort of reading of these observations. Kepler was strange because he from these minute observations of Brahe, he traced out the beautiful elliptical orbits of the planets. But he remained, in many ways, medieval in the way that he was a mystic and believed in the perfection of the universe and that it had to obey certain mystical laws. And he put these beautiful elliptical orbits into a Plato's idea of the universe. So they were encased in solids. They followed these sort of strange mystic mixture. Although he followed the exact observations, he retained ancient mystical ideas. And these sort of, what do I call, superstitious ideas, they seem obviously superstitious and maybe wrong to us, but when they look at us, in only 100 years' time, many of our ideas will appear equally fanciful and based on superstition, perhaps, mistaken observation, or over-theorizing. I mean, nowadays we have string theory, which is theorizing upon theorizing upon theorizing, and we have no observation. No one has ever seen a string. It's string like tiny, or it's likely to. Well, maybe they will in 50 years' time, maybe 100. They're so tiny that they are as tiny as an atom in the universe. Can you imagine us seeing an atom? No, an atom in the solar system. I'm sorry. Seeing an atom.
No, I can't.
They're that small,
Yeah. Well, I mean, each era always thinks, each generational era always thinks we are the peak. And
yes,
assumes there's nothing further to go.
Well, yeah, that's true to a certain extent. We now realize that's, that we are putting forward hypotheses that are going to be overcome. But you're quite right. That's exactly how, for instance, who is it? Planck, who thought of quantum theory in 1900. When he went into science, he became a physicist, and he was very bright. And he was told by the great German physicists pre-1900, when he was a student, he said, they was told, physics is finished. It's been explained. There's only a bit of mopping up to be done. There's only measurements, only what they call stamp collecting. You've got to find out, how dense is carbon, how many atoms there are. There's only mopping up to that. The whole theory, it's all been explained. And then he came across this amazing observation, which brought about quantum theory, and he didn't really believe it himself. He thought it was an anomaly. And Einstein, 5 years later, came across trying to explain this anomaly. And they came up with this idea of quantum theory, which was so peculiar. In the end, Einstein gave it. Einstein, at the end of his life, said it can't possibly be true. This is too complicated, too filled with probability and randomness. There must be an underlying theory beneath this, which explains it. It can't possibly be true. So these people who began to discover this theory didn't believe it. And how are we going on?
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes,
excuse me.
I'm the one who should be called. My voice is permanently like this, and it's what I refer to as my mafia voice.
Yes, of course.
I make you an offer you can't refuse.
Well, your book opens with a hilarious fellow, Paracelsus, who is a fascinating character. Now, he's a scientist, but he has rather a unique way of proving to his audience his latest theory.
Yes.
which you open your book with. But I found him a very interesting character, and I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about him. He opens your book, and you've got a chapter devoted to him as well, haven't you?
He's a marvellous character. He is a beautiful blend of scientific observation and his real name was von Bombastus. And although the word bombastic doesn't come from his original name, he was a totally bombastic character. It describes him. He was larger than life. He drank too much. He talked too much. He behaved badly. And he was a constant rebel, which is why he could never get into academic life because they wouldn't tolerate him. I opened the book with the one time when he did manage to get into academic life. He met the great philosopher of this time, Erasmus, the great historian, and cured him of kidney complaints. Now, Paracelsus, as he called himself, which means above Celsus. Celsus was the rediscovered great Roman medical thing. His works had been republished in the Renaissance, and they realized that he was one of the great medical men of the Renaissance period. Now, Paracelsus immediately claimed that he was greater than Celsus, so he called himself Paracelsus. And he said he went to a certain university. We can't find any real object. We can't find any evidence that he went to university. He probably did, and was probably expelled. But the university he claims to have gone to in Italy, the records of that particular period are vanished, are missing. So he knew well enough. He probably knew that at the time. But so he then spent his life traveling all over Europe, earning his living as a traveling medical man. Now, he learnt old wives' tales and witches' practices and many of the myths and things which many were false, but many were true. Many of the herbs were used for true, and they did cure people. So the ones that worked, he stuck with. And when he came to, he theorized on this, so he was a very successful doctor. And when I opened the book, he just treated Erasmus, and Erasmus had a word with the university authorities, and he said, look, this man is the best doctor you could possibly have. Make him professor of medicine. And because the great Erasmus said, make him president of medicine, the university authorities agreed. And Paracelsus had a central theory behind much of his deep and profound external knowledge on cures. They had thought the idea behind medicine was that the human body was a chemical apparatus, and it changed food, which passed through the body and gave it strength, and then came out the other end. Now, to explain this to the assembled worthies in the university, he opened his lecture by walking in he wore an alchemist's leather outfit, which was, of course, outrageous, because in those days the academics wore gowns, and they were very pleased with it. He stormed in with a covered platter, such as a waiter brings a great dish in a restaurant nowadays. He stormed in with it and said, I will now reveal to you the secret of all medicine. And he lifted the platter, and on it was a pile of steaming turds, and these were excrement. His point in outraging everybody was to show them that this was the chemistry. The human body took in nutriments. It was a chemical process, and it gave rise to this, and excreted the poisonous and the other elements that we don't need. This, of course, was a very profound point, But naturally they didn't appreciate the way in which he made it. Students did, of course. He was always very popular with students, but with the academics, not quite so, because in those days, academics had to struggle to be taken seriously. And so you had to have dignity, as they do now. I mean, if you make a mess, you're expelled from, if you misbehave yourself too much, you're expelled from academia. It happens to this day. I won't name any names, but there are a certain great historian in our lifetime at Oxford had tenure, but became so impossibly drunk that he became an embarrassment. And so the authorities arranged for him to become a professor in a country I won't name. He went on with his work. How much he managed to cure himself, get himself off the bottle, I don't know. But he remained a pretty damn good historian. And his final works, he's dead now, but I won't name him. People can now hunt about and try and find his name. The cast of Oxford dons of that era, who were not only very great and learned, but were completely alcoholic, is quite large and varied. So got a lot of thinking to go if you want to find that one out. So you can't have me up for slander on that call. Okay.
Wonderful.
Next question.
Paracelsus, is he, because he's controversial even to this day, isn't he? Some people think
Yes.
he is a bit of a quack.
Yeah. He was a man for drama, as you can see from that thing. And when all else failed, he became a quack because he was wandering along the roads, and if he didn't earn a living, he starved. And often you'd arrive in town, and the richest man in town wanted a horoscope told for himself and his wife to show when they would have children. So he would make out a perfect horoscope for them and get paid for it. So he wasn't above doing certain things like that. He was also the father of certain alternative medicines, which remain, let's say, of deeper following. I won't name them, but your people will know. I mean, deeper following in Germany, where they have a much deeper following for what you might call health medicines, herbs and that sort of thing, alternative medicines.
Perhaps even our present monarch.
Yes. I won't go so far as to say that he's a follower of Paracelsus. I understand it stretch, but Paracelsus is taken as a very serious medical figure in Germany and much more of a joke in England, in what you might call the Anglo-Saxon world. In fact, there should be a quite certain swap over there. He should be taken a little less seriously in Germany and a little more seriously in Britain, I think. But
Yes.
That's my
I think that's quite right. And you've mentioned the Medicis, and you do devote a chapter to Catherine de Medici, who's a very interesting woman, and that she's present, and some might say certainly very heavily involved in an incident, the St. Bartholomew Days massacre. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that, because I always find that particular event just fascinating, horrifying, but fascinating.
It is horrifying. It's fascinating. For those who don't know the full details of it, France was going through, riven with strife between Catholics and Protestants. The Protestants were the Huguenots. Catherine de Medici was the ruler. Well, she was the mother of the ruler. And the Protestants, the Huguenots, were invited to Paris for a wedding and to solve their problems. Now, how much she was responsible for the massacre of the Huguenots, which took place during this just before this wedding celebration is a very moot point. Leonie Frieda, she read a marvellous book on Catherine de Medici, and I happened to be on the stand at Aeon Y with her, and we both took in turns. And we had this, Catherine, Leonie was in the middle of this talking about Catherine, and she had a very knowledgeable man who had a bee in his bonnet about the St. Catherine's Day massacre, which is beautifully described in her book. I describe it obviously in less detail in mine, and she came to her own conclusion on it. This man's hobby horse was the massacre symbolism, St. Catherine's Day massacre, and he wouldn't have hard questions. So in the end, we had to turn over to me, who didn't know anything at all about it at the time, and get her out of a fix, because when someone has an idea that Catherine de Medici was utterly responsible for it, and there's overwhelming evidence, you can't dissuade them. I think she certainly had it's difficult to say, and I hope I point that out, well enough in my book. I'd say it's etiquette, let's just say circumstances ran beyond her control, and that's why the Huguenots then started to leave France. Well, they had been leaving France for a long time. They left mainly to Holland, where they had freedom of worship, and certainly to England. There are Huguenot houses in Spitalfields, where you can see them to this day, and there are many names in Holland that sound French, and if ever you see the South African rugby team, you may maybe wonder why amongst the white players there are quite a few French names. Those names are Huguenot names from the ancient Huguenots who lived in Holland. So when you see Springbok players who have Huguenot names, likewise in Ireland you have certain names which sound French. They are from Huguenots who went to live in Ireland when Ireland was ruled by the Protestants. It's just one of those things. And there's some beautiful old houses in Spitalfields, which you can see they're old Dutch Huguenot ones. The Huguenots who came to Britain built, and you can still see them, beautifully preserved.
We're coming to the end of our chat, but there is, and it's just such a fascinating, so many things I could talk about. But I was thinking when I was reading the book that probably the most revolutionary, and I guess I say this for selfish purposes, given that I'm in the world of books now, it's Gutenberg's invention of the printing press. If you were to pick one, I mean, for me, it would be Gutenberg, but I wondered what you thought would be, if you had to pick a figure from the book, the most influential.
Three figures who made the most difference are quite obviously Luther, Copernicus, and Gutenberg. Gutenberg made the printing press. It had been invented many years before in China, but he was the man who actually invented it in Europe. The history of writing and books is fascinating. The earliest writing was on papyrus, of course, and the Greeks, for instance, I think Socrates was the first to say it. Socrates, who wrote nothing down, by the way, and Plato, who wrote everything about Socrates down. So that's all we know about him. There was a belief that writing down these ideas instead of memorizing them was the death of memory. Homer's Iliad was remembered and spoken by poets, by travelling, who remembered it from beginning to end. Our memory gets shorter and shorter because with papyrus, all we need to do is read it. With a book, we can learn it and then we can refer to it, like I had to refer just now to something I'd forgotten. But it extends our learning enormously. I mean,
just sorry to interrupt, but so their memory, particularly for the ancients, their memories would seem almost superhuman to us now. Then,
yes, many. I mean, not all of them, of course, but I mean, a poet who would sit and recite Homer's Iliad, or even half of it. It's quite a memory, quite a feat of memory, and that's because to do anything when you didn't have anything written down, you had to remember it. Now, when things were written down, you had it in scrolls, and this was why the library at Alexandria became famous, and then the one Pergamum became. They had scrolls. Papyrus, the word papyrus comes from corruption of the word Pergamum, which is where they also had many papyruses. Or one of the derivations. But the next great step was printing. Now this meant that everyone who could read could see something. And it meant that things could be very quickly. It meant that things could be printed not in Latin, which was the language of scholarship, but they could be printed in the language of the people. It's caused a tremendous... I mean, Tyndale was beheaded in England for translating the Bible into English. You know, there was a vested interest in the Catholic Church, particularly in them explaining the Bible to their flock. Now, the whole idea of, most of the idea of Protestantism was to get rid of the middleman, speak directly to God. And that was an enormous revolution. And it meant tremendous independence to the human mind. And we had, therefore, our own interpretation of God to this day. Not perhaps in Russia, but in other places. We believe in freedom of interpretation, and you've got to argue your point against other intellectual points which are experienced, not theorized. But this comes from books, and you'll be quoting a book. You'll be someone quoting a book against you. The ideas will come from a book. We won't do the experiments all the time. You've got a huge... That's where you have a reference. And we have the British Library now. Bibliothèque Nationale. I mean, these are references to everything. You can go in if you want. Yeah, I could go in there and ask for the first copy of Shakespeare's plays and something that was written 600 years ago, and I can get it within half an hour in my hand and look at it. And exactly the same as the first man who owned it can look at it. It's extraordinary. And but that's what books brought. Books meant we could have you get it in popular things. Sherlock Holmes, especially what's his name? The one with who's the elder
Cumberbatch.
Talking about his mind palace. Now that's when he builds a library in his mind, and it's a method by which you place a certain memory in a certain place. Now, I don't have a mind palace. Some people do use that as a mnemonic idea to remember things. You perhaps don't have a mind palace. But if I asked you, by the way, where was Einstein born and what date? You'd say, well, I don't know, but I can look it up. So your mind palace is your bookcase. Part of it you can see over there, which is mine. And so, you can look some things up, and that's the power of print. You can, the huge, say nothing entertainment, the huge value of being able to read anything, and you can learn more and more. Everything is open to you, so long as your intellect can grasp it. And that's what education is. We are the species on Earth that takes longest to grow up in the way that we become students. We can still be studying for PhDs and further stuff in our dotage. It's like you talk about difference between German attitudes and British attitudes to Paracelsus. People say that what is the resemblance between Jesus Christ and a German student? because they're perpetual students there, that a German student resembles Jesus Christ because he wears sandals, he has a long beard, and whenever he does anything at all, it's called a miracle.
Wonderful. Are you still learning now then, Paul? Because you've written countless books.
Of course. I mean, it's you always suffer from, and I certainly deserve to suffer from imposter syndrome. Because if you write a book, you do an enormous amount of research for it. So you know it. But I've got my book in front of me here, and I'll refer to it, but I can't remember everything in it. Of course not. You move on and you focus then on your next book, and that is, I think that's the fate of all writers. They go on and they move from one to the next to the next.
Well, Paul, thank you so much. It's been fantastic.
Great talking to you, and I hope you find some of this some use.
I do hope you enjoyed that chat. It certainly opened my eyes to a new era of understanding that revolutionised Europe. Thank you for listening. Plenty more content coming up, including Napoleon's invasion of Russia. If you can, please do recommend this pod to your friends and family, and rate and review if you can. It really helps this independent podcast to grow. You'll find links in the show notes, and until next week, thank you and good night.